At the White House this week, President Obama had to bid his official goodbye to the only Treasury Secretary he has ever known as president, Tim Geithner. And in so doing, President Obama uttered a phrase that I have never heard before. I've definitely never heard it in Washington, but this saying is apparently common inside the U.S. Department of the Treasury, and it has now been liberated outside of its walls.
Yeah, there's an unofficial saying over at Treasury: no peacocks, no jerks, no whiners. That'd be a good saying for all of Washington. No peacocks, no jerks, no whiners. Few embody that ideal better than Tim Geithner.
Tim Geithner looks like he's about to explode with laughter listening to the president say that. But the phrase is no peacocks, no jerks, no whiners. I mean, jerks and whiners, we all get that. But the peacocks part here, I think, is kind of a term of art. I think they don't mean peacocks in a generic way. I think they mean it in a way that is specific to the Treasury. And here's what I mean. Peacocks, as birds, are strutters, right? They puff their chests out. They like making a big show of their big, fantastic feathers. And no offense to our corporate overlords, I'm aware that you can see one particular tiny little peacock often up at the top of our screen right now while I am talking. In politics, the peacock metaphor means that you are talking about somebody who struts and doesn't deserve to be strutting. Someone who talks the talk but doesn't really walk the walk. And in the case of the Treasury in particular, the president's no peacocks line was put into further context when he went on in his remarks to introduce the new Treasury Secretary nominee just a few moments later.
As a congressional staffer in the 1980s, he helped negotiate the deal between President Reagan and Tip O'Neill to save Social Security. Under President Clinton, he presided over 3 budget surpluses in a row. So for all the talk out there about deficit reduction, making sure our books are balanced, this is the guy who did it 3 times.
He didn't just talk about balancing the budget and tackling the deficit. He did it 3 times. The president seeming to take a certain amount of pleasure in being able to describe his Treasury nominee, Jack Lew, that way, given the deficit peacockery which pervades Washington, honestly, particularly on the Republican side of the aisle. Republicans really like to talk about cutting the debt and cutting the deficit as if that is the long-standing prerogative of their party. But it was under Republican leadership that we passed 2 debt-exploding rounds of George W. Bush tax cuts, as well as 2 wars without any plan to pay for any of it. In the process, Republicans took a massive budget surplus that they inherited in 2001, and they turned it into a massive budget deficit 8 years later. The person that they inherited the surplus from, that would be a guy by the name of Jack Lew.
For all the talk out there about deficit reduction, making sure our books are balanced, this is the guy who did it 3 times.
3 times. Jack Lew's job in the Clinton administration is that he was Bill Clinton's budget director in the final 3 years of his presidency. And it was during those final 3 years of the Clinton presidency when the U.S. government, for the first time in over a generation, ran surpluses. Washington took in more money in those years than it spent. Take a look at this chart. You see those years in which the deficit stopped being a deficit and instead became a surplus? Those were the Jack Lew years. Those were the years that Jack Lew was in charge of the budget. Those were also the years in which debt clocks had to be unplugged because they'd never been programmed to run backwards. Of course, it was not Jack Lew alone who led us to that fiscal breakthrough as a country, but he was budget director. And with success comes bragging rights. And even though the Obama administration kind of declared war on peacocks in this announcement yesterday, it is worth wondering if they might not actually be better off if they did strut on these issues a little bit more than they like to. Because you would never know it from the way the deficit peacocks are crowing against this administration. But the deficit is now more than $200 billion smaller than it was when President Obama first took office. We are currently witnessing the fastest deficit reduction in this country since the end of World War II. That alleged big spending liberal, Barack Obama, has already signed into law approximately $2.4 trillion of deficit reduction measures over the last decade. And that total could be even higher, except that the deficit peacocks on the other side of the aisle in Congress keep balking at debt reduction ideas like cap and trade and the DREAM Act and closing tax loopholes, all of which would reduce the debt and the deficit, and all of which are policies that Republicans used to like until President Barack Obama said that he liked them too, and then they turned against their own ideas. Even the dreaded Obamacare was one of the biggest debt reduction proposals considered in Washington since the Clinton era, and Republicans hate that with the heat of 1,000 suns. So some talk the talk and others walk the walk, right? There is a school of thought that says that deficit reduction shouldn't actually even be a national priority right now. As we slowly recover from the most brutal recession since the Great Depression, there is a strong case to be made that the government should just borrow away. The government should take advantage of how low interest rates are, should take advantage of a market in which the world is eager to loan us money. We could borrow like crazy right now, invest that money in job creation and infrastructure and economic growth. We could worry about debt reduction when we are fully back on our feet. If we took that strategy, we would get fully back on our feet faster and, frankly, in a more sustainable way if we used that spending to invest in our economic strength. But the political world is going to reject, if the political world is going to reject or ignore that school of thought, if we are going to be all wringing our hands about the debt and the deficit all the time, we should at least get our facts straight about who has been better for the deficit and who has been worse. No peacocks, no jerks, no whiners. It sounds good in English, but it's going to sound even better when they put it in Latin on the back of a quarter.